What we're going to try to have a conversation with now is to talk through, some of the nuances and the tensions and pain points, quite honestly, with recruiting and retaining faculty and staff of color, especially amid the backlash and what is a pendulum swinging relative to what we're seeing in terms of anti-DEI efforts that have, taken root in some ways with K-12, but higher ed also being kind of ground zero for some of that. And so with that, we want to try to have some conversation to think through, again, how do we navigate this terrain and this landscape? Next slide. This is not anything new for most of you, but I think part of why we feel like there's a call to action and why this matters and what is frontal lobe and should be front of mind is that when we think about the changing demographics in terms of the realities of the change in demography, what we do see is a graying of society, a browning of society. And in particular, we see our institutions as microcosms for society at large. And so as we think about representation and that it matters, and part and parcel of why it matters is as we think about, this value proposition that we have to make for post-secondary and who is showing up to the door seals and who is crossing over the threshold, so to speak. Are they having equitable student experiences? Are students able to be in receipt of what are culturally relevant materials that are undergirded with culturally responsive practices by practitioners? And whether it's 2-year or 4-year, we are seeing some real concerns and challenges around that. Next slide. Because as we think about who is matriculating to, next slide, to higher ed, we also see a disconnect in terms of who they're being met with. And so this slide gives you, in terms of what is some of the more recent, if you will, data around who's in higher ed and by what classification in terms of employee group. And so you can see across kind of at a campus level, as well as more granularly, what's happening by disciplines and in terms of who's steering particular responsibility centers in terms of academic units via department chairs and heads, as well as senior administrators. What we have, and not unlike our K through 12 counterparts in terms of education, irrespective of the tier of education across the sector and the pipeline, it is robustly white. And then, the adage of higher ed being the ivory towers. It's not figuratively speaking necessarily, but quite literal as we look at who are our full-time faculty, with nearly 3 out of 4 full-time faculty. And then kind of unpacking who the faculty are by race and ethnicity, again, are largely majority population mainstream dominant culture. We also see that there are some changes with representation in terms of an ebb and flow of who is represented. And also when you look at it by race as well as gender, and unpacking some of that. That bullet that talks about BIPOC staff overrepresented within service positions. What readily comes to mind for me is I remember this is 24 years ago. I'm in my very first tenure track position at West Virginia University. And I had a student in an intro to higher ed seminar, and I'll never forget his name, Rick. Rick asked me, he said, "What are you doing here? Certainly you will feel more sense of community at one of them colored colleges," is what he told me. And, you know, I said, oh, I'm sorry that I wasn't quite prepared for. And he said, well, you know, it's just that I've never had a black. I've never had a black. He said, this is the last course in my second master's that I'm taking as an elective. And I never had a black faculty, like an instructor in grade school and middle grades and secondary during my undergrad or my first master's degree. So you're my first black. And I said, wow. He also went on to tell me areas I shouldn't travel, you know, because of safety reasons. And one of his classmates up here said, you know, stop that. And I said, no, don't shush him. Don't hush him up. Where should my narrow behind need not be? And should I end up someplace I shouldn't? Will I remain unscathed if I mention that I know you? Fast forward to the end of that semester in that class, I'm in the hall. Students are filling out their end of the course evaluations. When he came out, he extended his hand to me. He says, you know, Professor, it's been a pleasure. I shook his hand. I said, well, thank you. And as he's shaking my hand, he tells me, because you changed my mind about your people. And then he told me I was Cosby Show black. I was like, oh, the hits keep on coming. You know, because he said that the only images he had of black folk were from cops or on the news when, you know, somebody's being ushered into a squad car or what have you. And that who he had proximity to in terms of the only two black people he knew was the cafeteria lady and the janitor. And so hence this overrepresentation of service positions not being something that's that uncommon. And it's actually very mundane to run across in terms of folks are present, but it's not just that they enter, it's where they enter and where they're occupied. Next slide. So when we think about just community college context specifically, all right, within this larger higher ed landscape of 2- and 4-year institutions, that distribution in terms of some of the most recent data that we have available, i.e. from AACC, you know, kind of shows again what the buckets are, if you will, for where students see representation and staff. And that again, as you think about, you know, kind of moving from, or at least my left to right, the management piece of it, who is in a position of authority, who is ushering or steering, you know, the coffers and the supports around funding and resources and managing are primarily white professionals. We also still see with the faculty that that's the case. When we see student affairs, it's less so, but then when you disaggregate that data by employee group, you also kind of, that's where you start to see the various, you know, participation in terms of seniority and tier, new professional, mid-career, you know, folks that are more seasoned and have more years in terms of being veteran, and then pockets of where you see folks in student services, i.e. cultural centers and spaces, campus activities, more so than certain other areas of the student affairs sector. And then you can see, again, this doesn't necessarily completely align with what we see play out with who the students are, right, to the far right. Next slide. I think another reason why we have to think through when it comes to the extent to which it is a prioritization and strategic imperative to make sure that there's representativeness among our faculty and staff with that of the student body, is some of that commitment in terms of whether folks want to retrench and repeal and fall back and not step beyond their statements, because everybody had a statement to make post George Floyd. But as there's been a retreat from that, some of that again is informed by, and one of our ECs that are on right now, Felicia Commodore, who is a noted expert around you know, college board, whether it's community colleges, other special colleges and you know, four-year colleges, but that the traditional fare is that, you know, boards of governors, boards of trustees are by and large similar to that of the faculty, as well as senior admin and staff are white. And we see this play out even in some cases where we're talking about minority serving institutions, right? Of seeing, you know, greater shares of faculty that are not from racially minoritized backgrounds, trustees that are not. Next slide. So I want to just take a moment to kind of pause and ponder, because one of the things that we really want to spend some time, you know, kind of considering, and curious about your thoughts as you think about some of the institutional change initiatives on your own respective campuses. And as you think about your participation in REACH and other, you know, efforts, because you all have many initiatives, if not initiative fatigue, but how you leverage the promises of what these practices are and are informing how you want to improve, how you recruit, how you hire, how you retain a diverse array of faculty and staff in order to bolster an inclusive environments of excellence. What are some of the things that your institution is looking to make headway on? And what have you found to be some of the persistent challenges with regard to recruitment and hiring and retaining what is a diverse faculty and staff? There's ways in which, you know, there's, well, a couple of you all said this, that there's a way in which who we are is informing what we do, how we show up, and that it can't just be presumptuous on our parts that, you know, because somebody shows up as and they present as a person of color or a person from a minoritized, marginalized group in terms of membership, that their sensibilities, the cloth with which they're cut, or the ways in which they may move and operate within a particular space could actually heap on harm as opposed to be helpful or advancing what we want to see in the way of equitable student experiences as well as outcomes. And so as we kind of think about the different spheres of influence that we all have, and think about the contextual nature of what's informing, you know, and Louise was saying, you know, giving us some backdrop and story around, you know, the pendulum again swinging where, and I imagine that by the time we get closer to, you know, this being an election year with the fall, that there's also going to be an uptick in terms of some of those states that have and local municipalities that would have turned over to, again, being much more explicitly and openly anti-DEI, whether it be, you know, pulling books off the shelves, saying that, you know, we shouldn't teach Black history, we need to, you know, limit certain types of titles, or within higher ed. I mean, just in the last month with Florida, you know, we're now coming up with new principles for sociology, like it's a ban on sociology, you know, because it's undergirded with, you know, thinking about race and gender and class. And so I think, you know, all of these pieces are informing how folks are thinking through, if it's even, again, front of mind, representation, how we do outreach, how we recruit, and the extent to which we seek to, with our talent acquisition, cultivate it, pour into it, and create environments for folks to thrive, and to provide optimal learning environments for our students, as well as be retained and have opportunities for advancement. So next slide. And I'm kind of doing a little filler here. Jason's under the weather and wishes to be with you. So we're doing some little tag team in here. But this was a quote that he had woven in that he wanted to highlight and share. In particular, I think in terms of just pullouts around institutional leaders needing to understand the specific challenges. And again, this kind of helps to highlight as a case in point around some of this, while there's transference or transferability of thinking about what's happening from one context to the next, that a lot of times it is actually quite specific in nature. And to take the pulse of these things in terms of understanding the nuances of context before enacting the change and being transformative in the way that we need to in order to really get a sense of what types of interventions, what kind of actionable strategies are going to help to move the needle. Next slide. So one thing that we, some of you may be familiar with this already, but was one of the things we wanted to kind of put on your radar in terms of a resource, a framework, as you're thinking through some of this, is to take a look at Kimberly Griffith's work around, self-assessment. So as you think about your own campuses, what is it that you have by way of a model for how you're moving the needle forward to increase? In this case, is framed, the framework is around faculty, but there's some applicability of the model as you think about institutional context and recruitment and retention efforts and for both faculty and staff. And some of this is informed by some of the work that Kim did to try to create what is multi-dimensional, if you will, if that helps, around understanding those factors that are forces that are impacting our ability to recruit and retain. And some of that's going to look different, of course, in terms of as we think about a process of self-reflection and assessment alongside, and we brought up earlier, understanding the data points, being informed by that, to undergird what our action plans and the implementation around a recruitment strategy in terms of hiring and retaining folk. But this is a model that we would encourage you to take a look at because, campuses really have to think about a comprehensive, program of recruitment and outreach and retention. And some of those core areas that, again, are very much tied to the institutional context is really with regard to what kind of commitments and investments are being made at the campus level. Because even if you have within a particular department or unit, the will and the value orientation of wanting to promote diversity and inclusion, if that is not seen in other levels and layers, particularly upward, then that strategy is not going to necessarily have much of a lifeline. As we think through how do you bring faculty from different backgrounds, what that onboarding and transition might look like, what kind of faculty development opportunities are there, the welcomeness factor, so that out the gate, there's an African proverb I love that says, if you want to know the end, look at the beginning. And the extent to which you're, looking at what your efforts are to bring in folk from from diverse backgrounds, what does that look like at the very start in terms of that effort, and that sometimes is a through line to maintaining, and keeping them to stay the course and be retained rather. And satisfaction can be tied to the satisfaction that they have with the institutions. But I'm not going to, in lieu of time, dig into much of this, but want to get it on your radar if you're not already familiar with it, because there's some good food for thought relative to the framework by Griffin in terms of how you might strengthen the pathways for faculty and staff of color in terms of their careers, and some recommendations I think that are fruitful for systemic change for how you do that to support you know, groups that are underrepresented among your faculty and staff, as well as, you know, pinpointing and thinking through what would be actionable strategies around addressing the barriers so that you can increase representation. Because it's in that this coupled again, and not too loosely coupled, or at least it shouldn't be, from where we want to be relative to advancing student success. Were there other comments or questions with that? Okay, I guess we can move to the next thing. And so here in terms of, again, this is probably not newfangled to you, as you think about overall where you are doing kind of more of that, you know, audit, if you will, on where your data is, going back to what Disraeli said a short while ago about kind of crosswalking that and thinking through what are the student demographics in alignment with the faculty and staff relative also to what's happening within the context of the community with which the institution is nested, and then also kind of within and between group looks at discipline and by department to see if there is some stratification. Generally speaking, it's not uncommon to see those segmented occupational you know, areas where there's more of a particular group, say in a service orientation, custodial staff, you know, or other things, but to think about across all of the compartments, what's happening there. Some questions, of course, there could be a litany of more questions. But with that latter one, last point, I guess as you're taking stock about your own context and some of the goals you all have relative to student success, relative to who you have on board or would like to attract and want to grow more of in the way of faculty and staff and representation. What do you consider realistic goals and metrics for closing those gaps?